I'm Alireza Fakhri, and this is an overview of US influenza activity week 50, 2022. Now, influenza activity in the US started to increase throughout October. So for the week of 39, which was reported on October 7, there were about 40,000 specimens that were tested for influenza, and 2.5% of these specimens tested positive for influenza. And of these positive specimens, 94.9% were influenza A, and the remaining 5% were influenza B. Now, among influenza A, 75.9% were H3N2 subtype, and the remaining 24% were H1N1. And the rate of mortality was reported to be 8.7%. Now, this rate of mortality does include COVID-19, influenza, or pneumonia. Now, throughout October, the activity increased, so more and more respiratory specimens were tested for influenza as more and more people were having respiratory infections, and we can see that the rate of positivity for influenza continued to increase throughout October. And more specimens were available for testing. The CDC started to do sequencing the specimens so that we know exactly what type of subclade and subgroup were included in this. Now, not all of these specimens were sequenced, so these numbers represent a small portion of these specimens. For H3N2, the sequence samples were 100% 2A.2 subgroup, which is exactly the subgroup that's included in the influenza vaccine this year. For H1N1, we can see throughout October that about a quarter were 5A.1 subgroup, whereas 3/4 were 5A.2 subgroup, and 5A.2 is what's included in the vaccine this season. Now, this may have seemed a bit concerning early in October because 5A.1 was not included in the vaccine, but as we progressed throughout, we saw that more and more of these sequences were actually 5A.2, which is a good news. Now, when we look at what happened throughout November, we see that activity continued to increase. So more and more specimens were tested for influenza, and the positivity actually went as high as 18.2%. Now, the large majority of these, 99.6%, were influenza A, with a tiny portion being influenza B. And again, almost 100% of H3N2 were 2A.2 subgroup. And for H1N1, the large majority, 93%, 5A.2, with a small portion being 5A.1. Now, unfortunately, mortality rate continued to be in the 9%. And when we move to December, all the way through week 50, we see that the specimens are in the 100,000s, with positivity being around a quarter of these, so 24.4% positive for influenza, and again, large majority influenza A at 99.5%, with a small portion influenza B, and again, almost all of these H3N2 being 2A.2, and when it comes to H1N1, almost exclusively 98% 5A.2. Now, unfortunately, mortality rate continues to increase, so we are now at 12% mortality due to either COVID-19 or pneumonia or influenza. So now when we look at the big picture from October through December, we can see that there was a sharp increase in the number of influenza positive tests, and then we are kind of steady as we are concluding the year through December. Now, some of these numbers continue to get updated, so we'll see if this is steady or going down or going up in the next week or so. Now, one thing that's important to pay attention to is that this influenza season happens to be one of the worst influenza seasons over the past decade. We can see here on the y-axis the rate of hospitalization, and on the x-axis we're looking at the number of weeks, and you can see the red line is the current influenza season, and compared to previous seasons that the rate of hospitalization has been going up much sooner than normally historically we have seen. Now, this could be that we have started to see activity early and then perhaps it will go down, or it could be that this is going to be a very severe influenza season with rates continuing to go up and perhaps outpacing previous seasons. And hopefully that is not the case. Now, when we look at the map of the United States, we can see that the flu activity is pretty high throughout the country. So the darker the color, the higher the activity level. So for example, we can see in California, Texas, and a lot of the states, the activity is pretty high. So it is important to continue to encourage everyone to get their vaccines, as well as taking measures to reduce the risk of transmission. Now, when we look at the rate of resistance or reduced activity of antiviral agents against the circulating influenza viruses, the good news is that pretty much none of the circulating viruses that have been tested are resistant or have reduced activity. So pretty much, regardless of the type or subgroup, the rate of reduced inhibition to oseltamivir is pretty much 0%. The same about pramivir, zanamivir, and baloxavir. So the rate is 0%. So this is good news because our treatments continue to be active against the circulating viruses. Now, fortunately, here's what's in the flu vaccine this year. So for 2022-23 influenza season, we have only quadrivalent vaccines. So there are 2 influenza A strains in the vaccine, and we have 2 influenza B strains in the vaccine. One thing that we have changed from last year is essentially the H3N2, because there was a mismatch between vaccine and what was circulating last year. So this was updated. So last year, the H3N2 included the 2A.1, and what ended up circulating last year was 2A.2. So that got updated this year. And as I showed you previously, 100% of what's been sequenced so far seems to be 2A.2. So that's good news. With influenza A, the large majority of sequenced influenza A H1N1 seems to be 5A.2. With just a small portion being 5A.1. So that also seems to be good news as far as matching the circulating influenza viruses. Now, influenza B so far seems to be a very, very small portion of circulating viruses. Now, it makes a difference when there is a mismatch between vaccine and what's circulating. So here's what happened last year. So 2A.2 was circulating, but what was in the vaccine last year was the 2A.1. And this study that was recently published looked at adults age 18 years of age or older who were hospitalized with acute respiratory illness. And essentially, they looked at 295 influenza cases, 47% of which were vaccinated, and over 1,000 influenza and SARS-CoV-2 negative controls, 53% of which were vaccinated, and of course 864 influenza negative but SARS-CoV-2 positive controls, 49% vaccinated against influenza. And what they found was that influenza vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization was actually extremely low, 11%, and it did not reach statistical significance because 95% confidence interval went from a vaccine effectiveness of negative 19% to a positive 33%. So it crossed 0 and it lost statistical significance. Now, this was the overall results. Now, when we look at some subgroups, so for example, only adults aged 65 years or older, again, no benefit as far as vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization. For age 18 to 64, again, no statistical significance. When we looked at age 18 to 64 with immunocompromising conditions, again, no statistical significance. However, when we look at younger adults, so 18 to 64 without immunocompromising condition, the vaccines seem to work. So those with an intact immune system, meaning that their body was able to mount an appropriate response to the vaccine, even though there was a mismatch between the virus and the vaccine, there was still a 50% vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization. Now, these data are looking specifically at H3N2. This is not considering other strains of influenza A. Now, when they considered SARS-CoV-2 positive, the vaccine effectiveness was actually decreased, and a lower proportion of vaccinated compared with unvaccinated case patients required ICU admission. So that's also a good thing. So even if people did end up in the hospital because of lack of effectiveness, there was still effectiveness against admission to the ICU. So that is also good. Now, given that this year there is a good match between what's in the vaccine and what's circulating, it is important to emphasize the recommendation for vaccination this year. So anybody, all persons aged 6 months and older who do not have contraindication should receive the annual influenza vaccine. There is no preferential recommendations, so any product that's available, it's good to go, except for adults aged 65 years or older. So this is the new recommendation this year, and I will talk about 3 specific formulations that are recommended as preferred for elderly. Now, it takes about 2 weeks on average for the body to mount a response to the vaccine, so that's something to keep in mind. So vaccination should be offered during September and October and continued through flu season while unexpired vaccine supplies last. So, it's not too late to get the flu vaccine while the flu season is ongoing. People should still continue to get their vaccine if they haven't received it yet. And COVID-19 vaccines can be co-administered with influenza vaccine in case, people have concerns that they are getting their COVID vaccine and influenza at the same time. Now, these are the formulations that are available on the market this season. So we have FluMist, which is a live attenuated influenza vaccine. Now, this one is only approved for age 2 years through 49, and even in that age range, it's it's really not preferred. It's preferred to have the inactivated influenza vaccine. Now, these are all egg-based with the exception of the cell-cultured FluCellVax and recombinant influenza vaccine FluBlock, but the rest of them are egg-based. There are several formulations that are the standard dose of inactivated influenza vaccine, and these are pretty good for age 6 months and older. With FluCellVax, this one is cell-cultured, and it is for age 6 months and older. Recombinant, because this uses recombinant DNA technology, this is only approved for age 18 years and older, so this is not FDA approved for children. And the adjuvanted and the high dose inactivated were specifically designed for elderly, so these are only approved for age 65 and older. Here are the new recommendations for elderly. So starting this year, there are 3 formulations that are preferred. So either the high dose inactivated influenza vaccine, or the recombinant influenza vaccine, or the adjuvanted influenza vaccine. And essentially with the high dose, it has been studied compared to the standard dose in elderly, and it was found to have greater vaccine efficacy in elderly. So there was a 24% greater relative efficacy. So for that reason, the high dose compared to the standard dose has better efficacy in elderly. The recombinant also shows similar results. So when compared to the standard dose inactivated, the recombinant had 30% greater relative efficacy in elderly. And the adjuvanted, which uses MF59 to boost immunogenicity, when was compared to standard dose inactivated, showed 63% greater relative efficacy. Now, this seems to be pretty high, but it did have a wide confidence interval, so the benefit could be as low as 4%, but as high as 86%. But regardless, it doesn't matter which one. For the elderly, it is recommended to give one of these. Now, if none of these are available in the pharmacy, it is recommended to give anything that is available in the pharmacy that's age appropriate, as opposed to asking the patients to come back while you order one of these 3, because chances are that if the patient doesn't get vaccinated, there's a good chance that they will not come back later. So while they are there, it's best to give a vaccine, even if it's not one of these 3. Thank you for tuning in.